I am super excited for you to be tuning in today because we have Dr. David Burns, the founder of Team CBT and one of the grandfathers of cognitive behavior therapy itself. You'll want to hear his story of how he went to a psychodynamic marathon and how that influenced Team. Welcome to Talking Team CBT, where you'll hear stories from therapists and clinicians around the world on their journey and experience with Team CBT. Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Talking Team CBT, and we're super excited to be having the founder of Team, David Burns, with us. Thank you for joining us, David.
I'm excited to be on your podcast. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm want to kind of start with what led you to be interested in first CBT and then what led you to create Team?
Well, I got into cognitive therapy in the mid-1970s because I wasn't happy with what I was trained in, which was psychopharmacology and kind of traditional psychoanalytic type of talk therapy. Mm-hmm. You know, the patient talks and you listen, and no one was measuring anything, and very few of my patients, if any, were improving, much less, having dramatic recoveries. And I just wasn't happy with it because I never went into psychiatry for any reason or psychology, except that I wanted to work with people and help people. And it just wasn't happening. And then when I heard about Beck's cognitive therapy, it sounded pretty hokey, to be honest. And I thought, well, I'll try it just to prove to myself that it's just some power of positive thinking, like Norman Vincent Peale, some silly, superficial thing. But then I was surprised that it really started helping a lot of people that I was stuck with. And I said, there's something to this. And I think this is what I really want to commit my life to is psychotherapy. I had a grant from the federal government to develop a brain serotonin research laboratory at Penn. But our research showed that the serotonin theory wasn't valid. And I published this in the top psychiatric journal in 1975, and everybody ignored it until about 2 weeks ago. Finally, an article came out saying, it's actually, there's never been any evidence for the serotonin theory. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, that's what I've been telling you guys for 30 years. It's time you finally caught on. 40 years, really. But anyway, that was the first step. And then the second step was to realize that, well, Beck had made some real significant progress, and Albert Ellis also, that it wasn't working for everybody. And so I was trying to figure out, what is it about the people who aren't recovering really rapidly? How do they differ? And that's where I stumbled across the importance of resistance, and I developed motivational techniques. And I started improving all aspects of the treatment, the testing techniques, the techniques for crushing negative thoughts, just the whole thing began to evolve. And suddenly it had evolved so much, it seemed to deserve its own separate name. I was thinking maybe we'll just call it high-speed cognitive therapy, but I said that's really kind of selling it short. And then I thought of the name Team CBT, and I said that's really hokey, and I like it for that reason, because real highbrow people, they'll think this isn't fancy enough. You've got to have these fancy words. So I decided on Team CBT. And that was the evolution of it. I would say the drive behind all of those moves was to find a way of helping people both dramatically and quickly. And I used to wonder about that before I'd even heard of cognitive therapy. I thought, suppose this was like an athletic skill, psychotherapy, and there were certain techniques you could learn, and you could get better at them and get better and better. at helping people faster and faster. And I didn't know if it was realistic, but it was kind of a dream I used to have. And that's really what I think my entire life became devoted to making that dream come true.
Yeah, I mean, definitely I have seen how much you love helping people and you want to work with people. You're such a genuine spirit and kindness about you. And I mean, just one thing.
Most of the time, not always. The older I get, the more I recognize how cranky and asshole-ish I can be on a lot of occasions.
I think we all can be that way too. Well, not can be. We all are definitely that way at times, for sure. I know I can get crotchety too. And so that this aspect of taking CBT and just adding more and more and more to make it more and more effective shows how fast you do want people to recover. I think that's fantastic. Yeah.
But I've run into resistance all along the way, even in the earliest days. One of the first technique I created was the externalization of voices. And to this day, I think it's still by far the most powerful of all of the cognitive therapy techniques. But I recall I was using it when I was working with this young teenager. Well, she was, 18. She was a teenager, not young. But she had just horrific borderline personality disorder. And I said, we need something more powerful than this. Examine the evidence. Beck had about 4 or 5, maybe 6 techniques that were okay, but they were kind of boring and intellectual, and they weren't that dramatic or powerful or emotional. And I said, I'd like to have something more dramatic. And I had remembered from my medical school days, I used to go to these psychodrama marathons. I was a horrible medical student. I just cut my classes most of the time, but I loved going to these psychodrama marathons that were so dramatic, but they were dangerous. They were extreme. And I thought we could do something like that, but safer. And that's how the externalization of voices came about. But I remember when I first demonstrated it, I think I did a demo with this young, horrifically depressed teenager. And it was actually helpful to her, probably life-saving. But I remember there was this psychologist who had moved from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, but she was one of the early proponents. And she heard it and scoffed, and she said, "Oh, that's not cognitive therapy." Like I was some kind of dirty person or had betrayed something to have created a new and radically different technique. Beck, to his credit, said, "Oh, yes, no, this is cognitive therapy." And that I really appreciated when he made that comment. But I was surprised at how quickly people just decided, like cult members, like that there's this correct doctrine that you have to follow. And Beck kind of fed that. He wanted people to be loyal to him. He reminded me a little bit of Trump, to be honest. That same narcissistic, I'm the one and only way. And I think I've, to some extent, enjoyed putting things up in people's face and saying, you're just not the only way. There's other newer ways, but it does create a lot of resistance among certain mental health professionals who want to have the answer.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I just love hearing your stories, David. I feel like we've always learned so much from your stories, and I was just going to say that it's just like an honor to have you on our podcast, because I think for so many of us, your podcast and your approach and this, has just changed our lives personally and professionally. We're really so grateful that you kind of persevered past some of that resistance and created a team. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit, like what you see. People sometimes will talk about team as like, CBT on steroids, or like this, like you said, the high speed. And what do you see as like accounting for that type of rapid change that we're seeing with patients?
Well, I think there are several things that all go together. First of all, the testing, I couldn't do it without testing at the start and end of every therapy session. And I don't think any therapist can be adequate, much less great, without doing that. And yet we're the only people in the world who do it. The accuracy that we have of knowing how our patients feel is very poor. Therapists don't realize this, they don't believe it, but if you use the scales for a little while, you find out just how off base your thinking is. And I think that that's huge. And I've even started that in our app team, even some of the things where you can get ratings right away. Like when there's tension now in our app team, we say, let's just stop. And what's our grade right now? And then everyone will say, oh, C- or F or something. And then we talk over what's going on. And then we get on track. And it's not guaranteed to work, but it's pretty darn powerful. And it's been very helpful. And that type of thing, finding out when your patient likes what you're doing and when you're helping them. If you don't have that information, if you don't have the courage to get that information, as the Buddha said, and as quoted by Freud years later, if you're not measuring things, you're screwed. And I don't know if the Buddha said that or Freud, because neither of them measured much of anything. But you've got to have that testing and assessment. And therapists are even dead set against it. Not only they don't do it, but they think, oh, this is some horrible thing for inferior therapists or something like that. There's
it just takes tremendous courage to be willing to do it, because we're all going to see those, those where we're missing the boat and all those failures. And I think you've really taught us that that's often like the best thing to see sometimes.
Yeah. And then you've got to develop your empathy skills. And mine started out pretty sucky, and they still are pretty sucky often, but I can fake it really well now. And when I need to and concentrate on the 5 secrets, I can. And I have my own ways too of developing a connection with people. And I think people have to really trust you, and you have to be using the empathy scale and finding out how you're coming across. And I don't always come across well, but I always know when I'm not, because my patients, they blast me. And foolish therapists say, oh, people won't be honest on those scales. That's why I don't use those scales. But you're wrong. People are honest, and that's why you're not using them, because you can't take the heat.
Really honest.
There's this guy on our app team. I just love him. He's just warm and humble and brilliant, and we always have these joyous interactions. And you can just see how much he loves every moment of what's going on. I asked him just recently, "What's our grade now?" And he said, "Oh, it's about an F." I couldn't believe it. And then he explained, what was turning him off, and we talked about it. And then we got up to an A+. But without those kinds of assessments, you're lost. And then, of course, the what I used to call paradoxical agenda setting or assessment of resistance, whatever you want to call it, that's for many people has really opened the door to the possibility of high-speed change. And that's the thing that most therapists kind of don't know how to do. They're afraid to align with the patient's resistance, and they keep trying to help people, which forces patients to resist. And then finally, I think the fourth piece is the methods, and having powerful techniques like the externalization of voices and the acceptance paradox and the counterattack technique and the self-defense paradigm and the downward arrow and all of these fantastic techniques that I've created or learned or other people have created. There's a lot of really great techniques available, and it's gone far beyond examine the evidence. And although still sometimes that technique can be life-changing for certain people in certain situations. But I think it's really those 4 components. But then there's other stuff too that we don't talk about very much. Like there's a lot of humor in my therapy. The most I ever laughed was with a patient. She came in and she made an announcement, and we both started giggling. and we could not stop giggling the entire session to the end, because it seemed so outrageous that we would be laughing at what she had said. And I thought, I'm going to get sued, or this is a ethics violation, because what she said was, my father just died.
Mm.
And then we laughed uncontrollably for 50 minutes, practically fell out of our chairs. We were both giggling. Well, why? Well, because she hated her father. It was her sixth father who had died. And her mother would marry these cranky, elderly multimillionaires who would then die, and she'd inherit this money, and then she'd marry another one. And my patient never had a good relationship with any of them. And but it was like dark humor, but it was really funny. And to this day, we remember it. She calls me every now and then. I give her unlimited free tune-ups for the rest of her life, like I offered all of my patients. And we still kind of laugh about it. It probably seems disrespectful now, even to your listeners, but I love humor, and I love to laugh. I remember when our dear departed Marilyn Coffey came in and said, I've just been diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. And I was working with her, I think with Matt May. And it was just devastating, because she'd never smoked. She had no idea that she had lung cancer. And bless her heart, she lived for years after that diagnosis. But I remember she came in and we did it on a podcast. And when I listened to parts of the podcast, we were giggling about a third of the time. And I just think that laughter is so healing and so needed, because there's so much awfulness in life and within ourselves. And then storytelling is another thing that we don't formally teach, but I do a lot of storytelling, and my stories always have embedded messages on maybe one or two or even three different levels. And I don't know how we got into this, but I also think that's a part of the effectiveness.
Well, that was what you were telling us. Like, it's not just the T, E, and the A and the M, but also these other parts people wouldn't realize, the storytelling and the humor. And I've definitely seen that in a lot of the personal work that you do. That's often the turning point is that laughing cure. One of my favorite things you do quite often is where you're looking at a list of negative, distorted thoughts, and you're like looking at them and seeing one of them, and you look at, then you have, I'm a loser, and you say, like, no, we're just looking for distorted thoughts, like not true ones, right?
Yeah, right, yeah.
Gets everyone laughing.
Yeah. I said that in a workshop once somewhere out of near Washington, D.C. I think it was in Virginia or something like that, and there was some really angry guy in the audience, and I didn't know he was. I pulled that one on him, and he went into a rage. It was a big flop. But usually people really enjoy that. That's the thing about humor. Occasionally it will fail, and people will take it as a sign of aggression rather than let's laugh together. So it's like all powerful techniques. It's not just real simple to use.
You mentioned about how important testing was and empathy, and those who are listening, we just had a couple episodes ago, just kind of got tongue-tied. Daniel, help me out with his name. Oh, I can't believe it. Hassam. We had Hassam on, and he was saying how he was trained in narrative therapy and in Rogerian therapy, humanistic. And when he heard your podcast, he's like, that's, baloney. And so he wrote you a letter, and then you replied and had such a genuine warmth to your reply online that he was like, man, this guy's for real, that he's genuine, which is a big part of what you teach in team, that as therapists, we need to be genuine, that without that piece, it's just blowing smoke with our clients. It's not going to fix anyone. And so I think there's a lot of principles in team, not just the TEAM, but like the humor is extremely important, and the storytelling and sharing. And
Yeah, and it's also a spiritual dimension, because there's 4 deaths of the self for the patient in team, and there's 4 separate deaths of the self for the therapist in team. So that's perhaps another dimension of it.
Yeah. What's something that surprised you when you created team? What maybe was something you weren't expecting?
I think the most surprising thing, as you know, when I work with people for 2 hour session.
Mhm.
And like we're going to do it tonight in the Tuesday group, someone with having panic attacks and a conflict with her mother. And the odds are very high that we'll get a knock on wood. I don't want to take anything for granted, and that's not wood. I guess my desk is fake wood.
But, you'll get fake luck there, then, David.
Yeah, yeah. But we'll probably get a complete or near complete elimination of symptoms in one session. Mm-hmm. And that's what I dreamt about when I was young. Like, would it be possible for a human therapist to achieve the skill to do that? And it actually has evolved in that way. Most of the time when I work with people, I get a complete elimination of symptoms in a single session. And if I don't, I can usually, not always, but I can usually figure out quickly what mistake I made and then change it the next time I see the person, and then get a near complete elimination of symptoms. And I think that's been one of the surprising things, has been how incredibly easy it is to treat even the most severe forms of depression quickly in a single session. And then, of course, people don't like it when I say that. Then they think, oh, he's a con artist, and they get sometimes very hostile. One of the people on our team went to one of the Reddit groups because we wanted to get some people not familiar
Mm-hmm.
with the Feeling Good app, not familiar with me,
right,
to try out the Feeling Good app. And so she asked, if she could, post an announcement that we were looking for volunteers. It's free, and we want to see how it will work for people not used to David Burns or TEAM. And then the fellow said, well, what's the name of the app and what's the name of the website? And she said, oh, it's the Feeling Good app. It's feelinggood.com. And he says, well, you've just been, let's see, what's the word when you're X-listed or blacklisted or?
Yeah, blacklisted or.
Yeah, you've just been blacklisted. Don't ever return to this group.
Wow.
And it was so I mean, and very brutally aggressive language, and it was a bit of a shocker. Now, I assumed it was because there's a hate group, an anti-Burns hate group there among people who are committed to being endlessly depressed and complaining endlessly. It's not charitable to say that, but that's the way I thought. Maybe that's what's going on. They don't like it when people say you can recover because their experience with therapy has been so bad. But there was another interpretation, and maybe people are constantly going in there to try to exploit these people and sell things or something like that. And he said, you're trying to exploit these vulnerable people, don't ever try to return, so it might not have had to do with me or my message, but it sure sounded a lot like that.
Yeah, I think there's a fear, I know, for even myself, like as a clinician, I certainly can't offer my clients yet the David Burns 2-hour cure. And quite a few of my clients do get well in 3 hours, and others need several 3-hour sessions. And sometimes, there's a bit of like, well, why can't you do it like David? And I think there's maybe clinicians like myself who feel a little intimidated by those statements. And I imagine, even our listeners might be intimidated. And I want to show everyone we're on a journey together. And I hope to someday be as powerful as David. And I'm not going to give up just because I'm not that powerful yet. And I think there's, it's that fail as fast as you can, which we haven't talked about yet on this.
Yeah, the joy of learning and growing and developing. Techniques for relationship problems work just as fast. They're just as powerful. They're quite different, but they're also incredibly amazing. But that's a very tough sell in my experience. And I think Jill Levitt says the same thing, that people don't want to get close to someone they're pissed off at, or they don't want to look at their own role in the problem.
Yeah.
So it's not magic for everyone and for all kinds of problems. But yeah, I don't know what I'm supposed to say.
No.
Like if I say I've got some great news, I have something new, people don't want to hear it, and those who do want to hear it don't want to hear it because, well, I'm not as good as David. Well, I don't think I'm as good as Jill. So what? I mean, Jill is fantastic, and I probably have some skills that she doesn't have. We're all different, but it's all this kind of rating yourself and needing to be special.
Let Daniel's got a question to ask here in a second. I just wanted to say one other thing is I have had clients who felt like they were failures because they didn't get cured in 2 hours. And so I just reassured them that, no, I'm still learning too. And that sometimes we're building skills that they do recover. If I show them their scales, they've actually recovered in the session, but the neural pathways take time for them they got to do the homework, right? Homework.
It took me years to get to the skill level and the experience level that I have now. When I was in private practice in Philadelphia, it wasn't nearly as fast. I always had the occasional person who responded quickly, but I think I had an average 17 sessions or something once I looked at the mean sessions of my patients. It took a while, and it's been over the years that it's just gotten better and better. I think the fact that I treat people for free and I treat them in a 2-hour session or a lot longer, just like, we'll just sit down here and we won't get up until you're cured type of thing. And it's just a different setting for people. It's a different series of expectations.
Yeah, a different framework that creates that and creates the opportunity then for the team approach to create that rapid change.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Angela touched on homework. I'm so glad, because I wanted to ask you about, what another ingredient here for rapid change, and something that, of course, we really insist upon with everyone that we work with is homework. And maybe you could talk a little bit about why that's really so essential.
Yeah, well, it's a common sense thing, but I proved it statistically at my clinic in Philadelphia because I published an article in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, which is a very prestigious research journal for clinical work. And I was trying to find variables that would explain, therapeutic success or failure. And I studied all kinds of things that did not pan out. But the one thing that really panned out was just how much homework did people do in the first 12 weeks of therapy. And I had them estimate it, and I estimated it separately, just on a simple scale, like a 0 to 5, not at all, and 5 would be all the homework. And the data showed that all the improvement in hundreds of patients during the first 12 weeks of therapy was with those who did at least some consistent homework. And everyone who did at least some consistent homework improved a lot or recovered completely in the first 12 weeks. And every single person who refused homework failed to improve, 100% of them. It was a black and white thing, and a lot of them deteriorated. Some of them just dropped out of therapy, but it was so clear cut. And that was when I made the policy to begin requiring homework if you want to work with me. And that has become very controversial also. There are people at Stanford just hate this, and they think I'm a pariah because I require patients to do homework, like I'm some kind of a evil monster or something like that. But it's simply saying to the patients, I think Jill has a beautiful way of saying it. Listen, one of the ways that our therapy works is through homework. It's like if you're trying to learn dancing or tennis, you can go to an instructor or a coach. But if you don't practice the new tennis strokes or practice those dance steps, there's a zero likelihood that you're going to be able to learn those skills. It's just the way it is. And if you don't like it, then I'm not the therapist you're looking for. And hey, there's tons of therapists in this community who like yourself, don't believe in the value of psychotherapy homework. And you can just go and talk your heart out to them for months, years, or decades or more if you want. And they'll love every minute of it, and you'll love every minute of it. Maybe that's your cup of tea. But I don't know how to do that. That's never worked for me.
Right.
And believe me, I tried it.
Taught us, yeah, how to do it with that empathy. Like I just wouldn't know how to help you without the homework. Right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like cruel to have you keep on coming to see me if you're not going to do the homework, because we'll just be spinning our wheels, and I would have want that. So yeah. I think to me that's been the change, where we're not saying to them that there's something wrong with them for not doing the homework, but that it just, we want them to recover, but that's the pathway that they need to be on.
It's like learning math or anything. I used to be so amazed when I was taking a math class or in college, a physics class, and there's at the end of each chapter, there's things that you have to solve, problems that you have to solve. And they're generally not that hard. They're challenging. But it was always amazing to me when I did those problems. And I said, oh, I get it now. I understand how to do this. You have a mastery of it. And that's exactly the same with the kind of thing that we're teaching. Sit down, write down your negative thoughts, identify the distortions, do a recovery circle, use a variety of techniques to smash the thoughts. And those aren't easy skills. You're not going to learn those just by talking to someone or even by reading a book. You've got to practice those skills and get good at them. It's just like anything else.
Yeah. And that's what, I guess, one huge piece of it, that is this deliberate practice that we need to achieve mastery. Would you say, though, a piece of it also for the homework is, we call this process resistance, but this notion of, overcoming some of the resistance to change, that if this is what we need to do to get the change, right? To come to sessions, to do the homework or exposure, whatever it is, would you say a piece of it is also overcoming the resistance to change?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, on the app, and we're seeing all the same thing in the app. The more of the exercises that people do in the app, the faster they get better. It's a perfect parallel what happens in real therapy, and that's one of the exciting things about the app, is it's confirming some of these findings from human therapy and showing this is true. If your therapist is an app or a human being, you've got to be working at it. And I just made another discovery because I do a lot of statistical modeling on the app. And I just made a discovery yesterday and today that you know that how you set a goal for yourself when you do positive reframing, mm-hmm. and how upset would you like to be if we had a magic dial, and found out that the goals that people set for themselves have a massive causal effect on the improvement during the basic training phase of the app. But I didn't discover that until I made a mathematical model on that type of thing yesterday, and it popped right out. And then I've been looking at it some more today, and in addition, so people who, and in real life, it's the same thing. If I'm working with someone and then for their goal, they say, oh, I want to reduce my depression from 80 to 40. I'm thinking I'm screwed, because they don't want much change.
Right. They want to hold on to it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I saw for the first time. The goals that people set for themselves in the app vary between just around 0 for 7 different emotions on a 0 to 100 to 31. And the higher they are on that goal, the more depressed they are at the end of the day, the basic training. And it's a fairly strong causal effect. And then I threw in a new variable in the latest beta test, because you throw these things in just on a hunch, and most of them don't pan out, but some of them do. And I had a variable during the relapse prevention training, do you sense in yourself a resistance to challenging the relapse thoughts you're going to have? I don't know why I put that in there, but people answer that, on a 0 to 100. And that also is highly correlated with that goal thing.
Yeah.
People who have that resistance to challenging their relapse thoughts are the ones who also have high goals for themselves. They want to hang on to a good bit of their anger and depression and anxiety.
You mentioned the relapse prevention. Love to hear more about that, because I'm sure our listeners they don't know what we're talking about there. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Yeah. Well, in the first place, relapse prevention is a waste of time if you're still depressed.
Right.
It's only when you've recovered, and that means that your depression has disappeared and you're feeling joyous and euphoric. And that's the time when you want to do relapse prevention training, because there's 100% certainty you are going to relapse, and you're not going to feel euphoric forever, although it seems that way. That's a positive distortion that people get into. And so there's two parts, as you folks know, to relapse prevention training. One part is the ability to use externalization of voices to crush ahead of time the thoughts you're going to have when you relapse. Like, you'll tell yourself, oh, this shows that my improvement was a fluke. The therapy wasn't any good. It was just a superficial Band-Aid. I really am worthless and hopeless because I'm more depressed today than ever. So that shows that the treatment was a failure, or the app was a failure. And the first thing is practicing crushing those thoughts, because they're massively distorted. But you won't be able to see that on the day you relapse. So I have people prepare for that ahead of time I become their negative voice, and we pretend it's 3 weeks from now and you've relapsed. And I say, oh, you've relapsed today. You had a fight with your wife or your husband or your partner last night, and you went to bed angry, and now you're more depressed than you've ever been. And this just proves that the therapy didn't work. You knew this would happen. And now you're way back to saying the truth about yourself. You're just a hopeless, worthless human being. Face it. And then they've got to crush it. And if they can't, we do role reversals until they can crush it. And that's half of it, is knowing you're going to have these thoughts. And then you have I have them recorded. So you'll have a recording of yourself smashing these thoughts. The second thing is that whatever technique helped you the first time will always likely help you in the future. So let's say you have the thought, I'm not good enough. And then we could try what are some techniques we could use for someone who says, I'm not good enough? Okay, positive reframing would be one.
I would look at the distortions.
Shades of gray.
Identify the distortions, explain the distortions.
Shades of gray.
Thinking in shades of gray. The double standard technique.
Be specific.
Externalization of voices.
Yeah, externalization.
Acceptance paradox, on and on. We could have a beautiful list of 30 killer techniques to blast that thought. Well, whatever technique worked for you the first time will probably always work for you. So you won't have to go through all of these methods, but you have to know that every time you're upset, it'll be the same kind of thing. Like one of my vulnerabilities is if I get the idea that some kind of authority figure has suddenly seen that I'm a bad person, I get panicky, and I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be destroyed now. And it seems so real, and it's just a vulnerability that I have, and we all have our own vulnerabilities. So you have to know what is the thing that's likely to trigger your anxiety and depression in the future, and what are the techniques that work for you. I can remember once I was a freshman in medical school, and I had this thought that I was a bad human being. And then I thought, my God, that's so true. It's not a distortion, it's just a fact. And then I said, well, what are you going to do about that, David? And I said, well, I think I'll just tell myself that if I'm a bad human being, that's God's fault because God created me. So I'll just do my best and let him worry about it. And then I felt better. That was my solution.
Yeah.
That was before cognitive therapy, but it was very helpful, strangely helpful at the time.
Yeah. And now we have dozens of other ways we would talk back to a negative thought like that. So I'm glad we covered relapse prevention, that really is so powerful. And I'm sure we could, David, talk to you for hours about everything. But if we could maybe just at least ask one more question. Thank you so much for your time. But if you could, if we had all the therapists in the world here listening, which would really be great for them to hear about this. What would be just, if there was just one thing about TEAM that you would like them to know?
About TEAM, well, I think the one thing would be to begin measurement, because even if you didn't know any of the things in TEAM, if you knew at the beginning and end of every session, you see, I did research at the Feeling Good Institute and made an unexpected discovery. I had data from 11,000 therapy sessions, and I had data at the start and end of each session, and empathy ratings and things like that. And I made the unexpected discovery that the improvement that a therapist can get with your patients the first time you visit, you meet them. Like I call that the recovery coefficient. It's like if, let's say, you come in to me, Daniel, and you have a score of 18 out of 20 on the depression test, and then we're doing whatever we do at the first session, but then you take the test at the end of the session. Let's say your depression has gone from 18 to 9. Well, that would be a 50% improvement. So that would be a recovery coefficient of 50%. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And that's actually your skill as a therapist. And if you average that out over 5 or 10 patients you see for the first time, you can calculate out to 5 or 10 decimal points your exact skill in every area, how skillful you are at treating depression, anxiety, marital conflict, anger, etc. And that recovery coefficient, which can be attached to the therapist, it can also be attached to the patient, but that will predict everything that happens from that point on in therapy. It's like all the outcome is written in stone, and no one's ever reported this before. But it was a massive, undeniable causal effect. And so if you'd start measuring, you see, and looking at your effectiveness, you'll find out right away if you're any good. And you'll also find out right away if you're empathic, and you'll find out you're not. And if you can take it, and if you care, maybe you'll start working with whatever methods you have available to become more empathic, to become more effective with your patients. And that's kind of what happened to me. And I found it so rewarding when I would see people improve. Then I'd say, well, what did I do in this session? How did that happen? And I did this in groups too, when I was running groups, and the same thing happened. I found that sometimes when I ran groups, I sucked. The group sucked. The ratings at the end were horrible. Sometimes when I was doing groups, like at the Stanford inpatient unit, they were pretty good, but nothing to write home about. And then about a third of the time, it was like it was miracles happening in the group. And at the end, we had this very religious nurse that always came and sat in and helped out when I was running groups. And when we'd have that third type of group, she'd say, "Today we walked on holy ground." And she was right, because it went beyond psychology. It was something of a miraculous nature, that the healing was so profound and it hit everyone in the group. It's like a presence came into the room. But all of that came about because of this simple measurement and assessment and tracking things. And if you have the courage to do it, it takes courage, because I'm so loose-lipped, I screw up all the time. And when I do, I get blasted. It hurts my feelings. I get ashamed often. But if you can take the heat, really excellent things can happen.
Yeah, if for our listeners, if you would like to do testing or learn more about TEAM, you can go to David's website, feelinggood.com, and we'll put the link in the description below. And it's also on our website, talkingteamcbt.com. And you can also get his podcasts on iTunes and wherever you get your podcasts, they're available. And you can start learning TEAM and start learning how to do testing. I know this is actually becoming more popular, so that's a good thing to start seeing. And I've heard some clinicians who actually teach at university level saying they're actually implementing and seeing more and more research how important it is to test during session, before and after session. So super excited, David, you've pioneered this for us and given us some great tools. There's also tools for therapists that they can get on your website, David. You've got the therapist toolkit, the ebook, Tools Not Schools. There's some electronic tools there. So really encourage our listeners to check out your website and your podcast. And just really so grateful you created this. It's changed my life personally and professionally. I know Daniel's nodding. And we're hearing those stories from clinicians as we're doing these interviews of how much TEAM has really impacted people personally and professionally. So our hearts and gratitude to you, David. Thank you for being here.
Well, it's an honor to be on you guys' podcast. I'm just so proud. I just love the heck out of both of you and have for a long time. But now here's this new thing you're creating. So I'm very excited for you.
Thank you. Thank you to our listeners. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.